The boardroom felt stuffy that Tuesday morning. Papers rustled as everyone settled into their chairs. I had been reviewing the land acquisition report for days, and something bothered me about the water supply section. My hand went up as Preston finished his presentation about the $2.3 million deal. "Excuse me, I have a question about the..." Preston's palm slammed against the mahogany table. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Every head turned toward him, then to me. His face twisted into an angry scowl. "Don't question my son," he barked, pointing a thick finger in my direction. "Hector is a Harvard graduate. Unlike you, he doesn't need help from a nobody." Uncomfortable laughter spread across the room. My colleagues shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact with me. Heat crept up my neck as I slowly lowered my hand. The words hit like a slap, but I kept my face neutral. I gathered my notes with trembling fingers, the laughter still ringing in my ears. But inside, I knew something they didn't. I had seen a critical detail in that report that everyone else missed. The missing water supply confirmation could destroy everything. Walking back to my desk felt like a parade of shame. My heels clicked against the marble floor as whispers followed me down the hallway. I could feel eyes watching me, judging me. Some people pretended to be busy with their phones, while others simply stared. I slumped into my chair and reopened the acquisition report on my computer screen. My heart raced as I reread the section about utilities. There it was, clear as day. Water supply confirmation pending. Not confirmed. Pending. This can't be right, I whispered to myself, scrolling through the pages again. The property was supposed to be developed into luxury condos. Without reliable water access, the entire project would collapse. How had Hector missed something so basic? How had Preston not caught it during his review? I highlighted the problematic section and saved the file to my personal folder. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I misunderstood something. But the nagging feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. I closed the file and tried to focus on other work. Who would believe me now? Preston had made it clear that my opinion didn't matter. I was just a nobody questioning a Harvard graduate. The undermining started immediately. Within a week, I noticed my name disappearing from important email chains. Meeting invites that used to include me suddenly didn't. Preston and Hector would huddle together in conference rooms, making decisions about projects I had been working on for months. My desk phone rang less frequently. Colleagues who used to ask for my input started going directly to Hector instead. It felt like I was becoming invisible in my own workplace. "Heard you're on thin ice," whispered Jake from accounting as he passed my desk. He didn't stop to chat like he usually did. I started keeping my own records of everything. Every email, every meeting, every conversation. I saved copies of all my work to my personal files. If they were going to push me out, I wanted proof of what I had contributed. The land deal moved forward rapidly. Preston praised Hector publicly for his thorough due diligence and Harvard-level analysis. I bit my tongue each time, remembering the pending water confirmation that still hadn't been resolved. Late at night, I would pull up the original report and stare at that troubling line. Something bad was coming. I could feel it. Hector strutted around the office like he owned the place. His Harvard diploma might as well have been tattooed on his forehead, the way Preston brought it up in every conversation. "My son graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School," Preston announced to a group of investors visiting our office. "He brings that Ivy League excellence to every project." Hector stood beside his father, chest puffed out, soaking up the praise. The investors nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by the credentials. I watched from my desk, remembering the water supply issue that still gnawed at me. Harvard degree or not, Hector had missed something crucial, but pointing it out now would be career suicide. During lunch, I overheard Hector bragging to some coworkers about his professors and classmates. "Professor Williams always said we Harvard grads think differently," he said, cutting into a steak. "We see the big picture that others miss." I nearly choked on my sandwich. He had missed the biggest detail of all, and everyone was acting like he was a genius. The irony was suffocating. I tucked the original acquisition report deeper into my personal folder. Someday, the truth would matter. I just had to be patient. My work started disappearing into Hector's presentations. A timeline I had spent weeks perfecting appeared in his quarterly review, word for word, without any credit to me. He presented it to the board like he had created it himself. "Excellent work, Hector." Preston beamed as the board members nodded their approval. "This timeline shows real strategic thinking." I sat in the back of the room, forcing a smile as applause filled the air. My chest burned with anger and frustration. Hours of my research and analysis were being praised under someone else's name. After the meeting, I went straight to my computer and emailed myself the original timeline with timestamps. The metadata would prove I had created it days before Hector's presentation. I saved every draft, every revision, every piece of evidence. This wasn't the first time it had happened. Small contributions, reports, and analyses were quietly being absorbed into Hector's growing portfolio of achievements. Each theft felt like another piece of my professional identity being stolen. But I kept documenting everything. If this continued, I would need proof that my work was being taken. The truth had to matter eventually, even in a world where Harvard degrees seemed to matter more than actual competence. The cafeteria incident happened on a Thursday. I was sitting alone, picking at my salad, when Hector approached with his usual entourage of admirers. He pulled out the chair across from me without asking. "Mind if we sit here?" he asked, but didn't wait for an answer. His friends settled around the table, immediately launching into a conversation about the land development project. I tried to eat quietly, hoping to avoid attention. "The thing about big league real estate strategy," Hector said loudly, glancing at me, "is that you need vision. You need to understand market forces that some people just can't grasp." His friends chuckled, following his gaze toward me. My face burned with embarrassment, but I kept my eyes on my salad. "Not everyone can think at this level," Hector continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "That's why you need the right education, the right background. Harvard teaches you to see opportunities where others see problems." I wanted to remind him about the water supply issue, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I finished my lunch in silence while they laughed and joked around me. Later that afternoon, a note appeared on my desk. "I saw what you saw in the land file too. A friend." I decided to try one more time. Preston was reviewing quarterly reports in his corner office, and I knocked gently on his door frame. "Preston, could I speak with you about the Jetstream property?" He looked up from his papers, already annoyed. "What about it?" I stepped into his office, clutching my copy of the acquisition report. "I noticed some questions about the zoning restrictions and utility access. Maybe we should." "Alicia," he interrupted, leaning back in his leather chair. "Hector has already done Harvard-level due diligence on that property. Everything is handled. But the water supply confirmation is still." "Enough." His voice was sharp and final. "Focus on your clerical tasks instead of interfering with real business decisions. Hector knows what he's doing." I stood there for a moment, stung by the dismissal. Clerical tasks. After 8 years with the company, he was reducing me to a filing clerk. "Of course," I said quietly, backing toward the door. As I left his office, I noticed the junior analyst who had agreed with me was no longer at his desk. When I asked around, I learned he had been reassigned to a different department. The message was clear. Stay quiet or face consequences. I decided to test something. In the next few meetings, I deliberately stayed silent. I didn't offer ideas, didn't ask questions, didn't contribute to discussions. I wanted to see if anyone would notice my absence from the conversation. Nobody did. Preston filled every silence with praise for his son. Hector suggested this approach, or Hector identified this opportunity, or Hector recommended this strategy. It was like watching a one-man show with a very enthusiastic audience. The team's culture shifted around this dynamic. Other employees became afraid to speak up, worried they might be seen as questioning the golden boy. Meetings became echo chambers where everyone nodded along with whatever Hector proposed. I watched this transformation with growing unease. We were building the entire company's future on the opinions of one person, someone who had missed a critical flaw in our biggest deal. During a presentation about the Jetstream property development timeline, I counted how many times Preston mentioned Harvard. 17 times in a 30-minute meeting. The education was being used as a shield against any criticism or questioning. Meanwhile, The water supply issue remained unresolved, buried in paperwork that nobody wanted to examine too closely. 3 months after the acquisition, whispers started spreading through the office. The development team was running into unexpected problems with the Jetstream property. Contractors were asking difficult questions about utility hookups. Engineers were flagging environmental concerns. "It's just standard red tape," Preston assured everyone during the morning briefing. Every big project faces these challenges. Hector anticipated this, but I could see the worry lines forming around Preston's eyes. The confident swagger was beginning to crack under pressure from the development team. During my lunch break, I overheard 2 engineers talking near the vending machines. "The soil surveys don't match what was promised," one said, shaking his head. "And nobody can explain the water access situation." "What water access situation?" his colleague asked. "That's the problem. There isn't one." My blood ran cold. The issue I had tried to raise months ago was finally surfacing. The nervous intern from the development team approached me later that day, looking scared. "Alicia," she whispered, glancing around to make sure nobody was listening. "They can't find reliable water access on the Jetstream site. The whole project might be in trouble." The disaster I had predicted was beginning to unfold. I couldn't sleep that night. I tossed and turned, replaying the moment Preston had silenced me in the boardroom. The humiliation burned fresh in my memory, but now it was mixed with a terrible sense of vindication. At 2 a.m, I gave up on sleep and opened my laptop. I pulled up my copy of the original acquisition report and began circling every inconsistency I had noticed months ago. The missing water confirmation, the incomplete soil analysis, the vague environmental assessments. My chest ached with a mixture of being right and dreading what was coming. How much money would the company lose? How many jobs would be affected? How many people would suffer because one person's ego had been more important than due diligence? I printed out the report and spread it across my kitchen table. Every red flag was there, clear as day, documented from the very beginning. I had tried to warn them, but they hadn't wanted to listen to a nobody. The scale of the approaching disaster was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about a single property deal. If the Jetstream project failed, it would take down other investments, damage relationships with contractors, and destroy the company's reputation. Nobody was prepared for what was coming. The bombshell email arrived at 8:47 a.m. on a Wednesday. I was sipping my coffee when my inbox chimed with an urgent message from the development team leader. "Urgent. Jetstream property development issues, all hands meeting at 10 a.m. The email explained that surveyors had confirmed the property had no reliable water supply connection. The entire site was essentially undevelopable without massive infrastructure investments that would cost millions more than budgeted. Within minutes, panic spread through the office like wildfire. People were running between departments, phones were ringing constantly, and I could hear raised voices coming from the executive offices. The $2.3 million land purchase had become a $2.3 million mistake. Preston's assistant rushed past my desk carrying stacks of papers and looking frazzled. "Emergency board meeting," she muttered to whoever was listening. "All department heads required." I sat at my desk, watching the chaos unfold around me. The disaster I had predicted months ago was finally here. The warning I had tried to give was about to become everyone's reality. My hands shook slightly as I opened my personal folder and looked at the original acquisition report one more time. Every red flag was still there, still circled, still dated from before the purchase. Preston called an emergency meeting to control the narrative, but the truth was already spreading too fast to contain. The emergency meeting felt like a trial. Preston stood at the front of the conference room, his face red with anger and stress. Board members filled the chairs around the table, their expressions grave and demanding answers. "This is clearly a process failure," Preston began, his voice booming through the room. "Someone in documentation should have caught these issues before the purchase." My heart started racing as I realized where this was heading. "Alicia was responsible for reviewing the acquisition paperwork," Preston continued, turning his gaze toward me. "Perhaps she missed something critical in her analysis." Hector sat beside his father, nodding along smugly. The Golden Boy wasn't going to take responsibility for the disaster. Instead, they were going to blame the person they had silenced months ago. The board members looked at me expectantly, waiting for my explanation or apology. I felt like I was drowning in their stares. But then something unexpected happened. A quiet voice spoke up from the back of the room. "Didn't Alicia try to speak in that initial meeting months ago?" asked Liana from Human Resources. I remember her raising her hand with a question about the property. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled through the room. Preston's scowl deepened, but he couldn't erase people's memories. Several other attendees nodded slowly, remembering that day when I had been humiliated and silenced. The room grew tense as more people began remembering that initial meeting. Liana's question had opened a floodgate of uncomfortable memories. "She did try to ask something," confirmed James from legal. But Preston cut her off pretty quickly. "What was your question, Alicia?" asked the board chairman, leaning forward with genuine interest. My hands trembled as I reached for my personal folder. This was the moment I had been preparing for, even though I hadn't known it at the time. I pulled out my copy of the original acquisition report with all my circled concerns and handwritten notes dated from before the purchase. "I had questions about the water supply confirmation," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. According to the documentation, it was still pending approval, not confirmed. Gasps filled the room as I laid the report on the table. Board members leaned forward to examine my notes. The evidence was clear. I had spotted the problems months ago, but had been prevented from voicing them. "These are dated from before the purchase," observed the chairman, studying my handwriting carefully. Preston's face went pale. Hector shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The narrative they had tried to build was crumbling in real time. "Why wasn't this brought forward during the decision process?" demanded one of the investors. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Preston scrambled to maintain control. She must have fabricated those notes," he stammered, pointing at my report. "This is clearly an attempt to cover her own mistakes." But I was ready for this attack. I pulled out my laptop and opened my email history, turning the screen toward the board. "Everything is time-stamped in my emails," I said calmly. "I sent myself copies of all my concerns on the day of the original meeting." The board chairman examined the email timestamps carefully. Other members crowded around to see the evidence. The metadata clearly showed I had documented my concerns before the purchase decision. "There's also this," said a voice from the corner. The junior analyst who had been reassigned stepped forward nervously. "I remember Alicia showing me these same concerns months ago. She asked me to double-check her analysis." More witnesses were emerging. The truth was becoming impossible to deny. Preston's face grew redder as his credibility crumbled before everyone's eyes. This is a conspiracy to undermine my leadership," he declared desperately. But the board members were no longer listening to his excuses. They were focused on the evidence spread across the table and the growing pile of testimony that confirmed my version of events. "We need a formal review," announced the chairman. "This situation requires immediate investigation." The internal review began the next morning. Investigators pulled every email, meeting recording, and document related to the Jetstream property deal. They interviewed employees privately, away from Preston's influence. What they found painted a clear picture of negligence and silencing. Meeting minutes showed I had attempted to raise concerns. Email chains revealed I had been systematically excluded from important discussions. Phone recordings captured Preston dismissing my expertise. The analysts who testified painted a damaging portrait of the father-son team. Multiple employees confirmed that questioning Hector was discouraged and that Preston had created an environment where his son's Harvard degree was treated as infallible. The due diligence process was compromised, the lead investigator reported to the board. Standard protocols were bypassed in favor of expedited approval. Meanwhile, the financial damage was becoming clearer. The Jetstream property was worthless without water access. Infrastructure costs to make it viable would exceed $5 million, making the entire project financially impossible. Other developers were already circling, knowing the company was desperate to cut losses. But every potential buyer lowballed their offers, knowing about the water supply problems. The board scheduled a special session to address the crisis and determine accountability. Preston and Hector would have to answer for the $2.3 million disaster they had created while silencing the person who could have prevented it. The special board session felt like a courtroom. Preston and Hector sat at one end of the conference table, facing a panel of angry board members and investors. The atmosphere was thick with tension and barely controlled fury. "Let's review the timeline," the chairman began, shuffling through investigative reports. The acquisition was fast-tracked despite incomplete due diligence. Warning signs were ignored, and the employee who identified problems was silenced. Hector tried to defend himself, his Harvard confidence finally showing cracks. "The initial analysis looked solid," he insisted. "These water issues weren't apparent in the preliminary reports." "But they were apparent to Alicia," shot back one of the investors. "She spotted them immediately." Preston attempted to redirect blame toward the sellers, the inspectors, the regulatory agencies, anyone except himself and his son. But the board had heard enough excuses. "The evidence shows a pattern of poor judgment," the chairman continued. "Qualified concerns were dismissed, proper protocols were ignored, and now we're facing a $2.3 million loss." The room fell silent as the magnitude of the failure sank in. This wasn't just about money, it was about the breakdown of basic business practices in favor of nepotism and arrogance. "Decisions will be made within 24 hours, the chairman announced ominously. Preston and Hector exchanged worried glances. Their empire was crumbling, and everyone in the room could feel it. I spent that evening at home, trying to process everything that had happened. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from coworkers, some supportive, others curious about what would happen next. The vindication felt strange. For months, I had carried the weight of knowing something was wrong while being treated like I didn't matter. Now suddenly, everyone wanted to hear what I had to say. Liana from HR called to check on me. "You did the right thing," she said, "standing up for what you believed, even when they tried to silence you." But I didn't feel triumphant. The company was hemorrhaging money, people's jobs were at risk, and relationships were destroyed. Being right about a disaster doesn't feel like winning when you see the damage it causes. Late that night, I pulled up the original acquisition report one more time. All my circled concerns seemed to glow on the screen like accusations. If they had just listened to me for 5 minutes, all of this could have been avoided. I closed my laptop and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring either justice or more cover-ups. In corporate America, you never knew which way the scales would tip. The future of the company and my role in it hung in the balance. The verdict came at noon on Friday. I was called into the main conference room along with other department heads. Preston and Hector were notably absent from the meeting. The chairman stood at the head of the table, his expression serious but resolved. "After careful review of the Jetstream property situation, the board has made several decisions." The room was dead silent. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for the announcement that would reshape our company. "Preston Williams has been terminated effective immediately for gross negligence and failure to follow established due diligence procedures," the chairman announced. "His attempts to cover up the failures and shift blame have violated the trust this board placed in him." Gasps echoed around the table. Several people exchanged shocked glances. Additionally, Hector Williams's consulting contract has been terminated immediately. His failure to perform adequate due diligence directly contributed to the $2.3 million loss. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The father-son team that had dominated the company for so long was gone, but their removal came at a terrible cost. The board recognizes that this crisis could have been prevented if proper protocols had been followed and qualified concerns had been heard, the chairman continued, his eyes meeting mine across the table. "Which brings us to our final decision." The chairman turned his full attention to me. "Alicia, your early identification of the problems with the Jetstream property shows the kind of careful analysis this company needs. Your documentation and persistence, even under difficult circumstances, prevented even greater losses." My heart raced as I realized where this was heading. The board would like to offer you the interim leadership position for the development division. Your role would be to implement proper due diligence procedures and rebuild the department's credibility. The room erupted in murmurs and whispers. Some people looked surprised, others nodded approvingly. I sat there stunned, trying to process what had just happened. "I thank you," I managed to say. "But I have conditions." The chairman raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Due diligence protocols must never again be bypassed, regardless of who is involved or what their background is. Every property acquisition must go through complete analysis, and all team members must be able to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. "Agreed," the chairman said immediately. "We want you to rebuild this department with proper standards." As the meeting ended, people approached me with congratulations and support. The weight of the responsibility felt enormous, but I also felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in months. Later, HR approached me about making the role permanent. Weeks passed as I settled into my new position. The empty office that had once belonged to Preston felt strange at first, but I gradually made it my own. I removed the pompous awards and replaced them with whiteboards for tracking project details. My first priority was rebuilding the team's confidence. Too many good people had been silenced or pushed aside during Preston's reign. I met with each team member individually, listening to their concerns and ideas. "We can speak freely now?" asked Tom from the engineering team. He seemed almost afraid to hope. "Not only can you speak freely," I assured him, "I expect you to. Your expertise is why you're here." I implemented new procedures that required multiple sign-offs on major purchases. Every team member had to review and approve acquisitions in their area of expertise. No more rubber-stamping decisions based on someone's credentials. The Jetstream property disaster had taught us an expensive lesson, but we could learn from it. I made sure every new employee heard the story during orientation, not to shame anyone, but to emphasize the importance of thorough analysis and open communication. Slowly, the department began to function like a real team again. People shared ideas, questioned assumptions, and worked together to find the best solutions. My phone rang with an interesting call, a potential buyer for the Jetstream property who might be able to work with the water access issues. 3 months into my new role, we had our first major test. A large commercial property became available, and the asking price seemed too good to be true. The old Preston would have jumped on it immediately, especially if Hector had recommended it. Instead, I assembled the full team for a comprehensive review. We spent 2 weeks examining every aspect of the property: zoning laws, environmental reports, utility access, soil conditions, local regulations, and potential development restrictions. Tom discovered flood zone issues that weren't immediately apparent in the initial listing. Liana found property tax complications that could have cost thousands annually. James identified easement problems that would have limited development options. 6 months ago, we would have bought this property and discovered these problems after signing, Tom observed during our final review meeting. And Preston would have blamed someone else when it went wrong, added Liana with a shake of her head. We passed on the commercial property, even though it meant walking away from what looked like a great deal. 2 months later, we learned that another company had purchased it and was already facing expensive legal challenges from the issues we had identified. The team's confidence grew with each careful decision. We were building a reputation for thorough analysis rather than flashy acquisitions. Our due diligence process was becoming a model for other departments. The Jetstream property finally found a buyer. A developer with experience in rural infrastructure was willing to purchase the land at a significant discount, knowing about the water access challenges. We recovered about 40% of our initial investment. Not great, but better than a total loss. During the closing meeting, the buyer's representative mentioned something interesting. "We've heard about your new approach to due diligence. Your reputation for thorough analysis is spreading in the industry." That comment meant more to me than any Harvard degree could have. We were becoming known for competence rather than credentials, for careful work rather than careless shortcuts. The board was pleased with our progress. At the quarterly review, the chairman specifically praised our methodical approach and risk management improvements. The development division has completely transformed, he announced to the assembled executives. They're preventing problems instead of creating them. I thought about Preston's words that day in the boardroom. A nobody. Now, this nobody was leading a department that other companies looked to as an example of best practices. Late one evening, as I reviewed reports in my office, I allowed myself a small smile. The vindication wasn't just personal, it was professional. Good work was finally being recognized and rewarded. A year after the jet stream disaster, I received an unexpected visitor. Preston's former assistant knocked on my office door, looking nervous and apologetic. I wanted to thank you, she said quietly, and to apologize for not speaking up when I should have. She explained that she had witnessed many of Preston's attempts to discredit me, but had been too afraid of losing her job to say anything. I should have supported you, she admitted. You were trying to save the company. More people came forward over the following weeks. Employees who had been intimidated into silence during Preston's tenure finally felt safe to share their experiences. The picture that emerged was even worse than I had realized, a culture of fear and favoritism that had infected multiple departments. Hector once told me that Harvard graduates don't need to double-check their work, revealed one former analyst. He said questioning his decisions showed lack of respect for his education. These conversations helped me understand why the company had been vulnerable to such spectacular failure. When you discourage questioning and analysis, disasters become inevitable. I used these insights to strengthen our new protocols. We created anonymous feedback systems, regular review processes, and explicit protections for employees who raised concerns. Never again would someone be silenced for doing their job properly. 2 years later, the development division had completely turned around. We had successfully completed 3 major acquisitions, all with thorough due diligence and profitable outcomes. Our careful approach had saved the company millions in potential mistakes. Industry publications began featuring articles about our risk management practices. Other companies sent representatives to learn about our due diligence procedures. We had become the standard for responsible property development. During a company-wide meeting, the CEO announced that our division's methods would be implemented across all departments. The culture of careful analysis and open communication that Alicia has built needs to spread throughout our organization, he declared. I received a promotion to Vice President of Development with equity stakes and a significant salary increase. More importantly, I had the respect of my colleagues and the satisfaction of knowing our work was making a real difference. But the best moment came when a young analyst approached me after a meeting. I have some concerns about the Riverside project, she said hesitantly. Tell me everything, I replied immediately. Your concerns are exactly what we need to hear. She smiled with relief and launched into a detailed analysis of potential issues. This was how business should work, with expertise valued over credentials and careful analysis prioritized over flashy presentations. Last week, I was walking past Preston's former office, now converted into a collaborative workspace for the team, when I paused to reflect on everything that had changed. The walls that once displayed Harvard diplomas and pompous awards now held whiteboards covered with project timelines and risk assessments. I remembered that humiliating day in the boardroom when Preston had called me a nobody and dismissed my concerns. The pain of that moment had never completely faded, but it had transformed into something powerful, a determination to prove that competence matters more than credentials. My phone buzzed with a message from the board chairman. The Jetstream case study is being taught at business schools as an example of how ego and nepotism can destroy value. They're using your response as a model for ethical leadership. I smiled, thinking about Preston's favorite phrase, Harvard-level analysis. My state school education and careful attention to detail had prevented far more disasters than his son's Ivy League degree had ever solved. The company was thriving, our team was strong, and young employees felt empowered to speak up when they saw problems. We had built something based on merit rather than pedigree, on careful work rather than impressive titles. As I walked back to my office, I whispered to myself, a nobody just saved this company $200 million in future mistakes. Sometimes the most important voice in the room belongs to the person everyone thinks doesn't matter.